Good morning and welcome to the Collaborative on Health and the Environment, Alaska Teleconference on International Actions to Eliminate the World's Most Dangerous Chemicals. Update from the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information on the following websites: www.healthandenvironment.org and www.akaction.org. This call will last 1 hour. Except for the speakers, all participants are muted during the presentations. There will be a time for discussion and questions towards the end of the call, and there's also a blog set up for this call. So if you think of questions during the presentations, we invite you to post them to the blog, and we'll do our best to get to them during the discussion time. I'm going to go ahead and give you information about how to get to the blog, and then I'll give that again towards the end of the call. To access the blog, go to healthandenvironment.org, click on News and Events, and then on Working Group Calls, and you'll find today's call listed there. Today we will be hearing from Joe DiGangi of the International POPs Elimination Network, or IPEN, and Waghiyi and Pam Miller of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, who recently traveled to Geneva, Switzerland for the 5th Conference of Parties to the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. They will be discussing key outcomes of the week-long international meeting, including the decision to ban the highly dangerous pesticide Endosulfan. It's my pleasure this morning to welcome and introduce our first speaker, Dr. Joe DiGangi. Dr. DiGangi is Science and Policy Advisor for the International POPs Elimination Network, also called IPEN. He represents IPEN on scientific technical working groups of the Stockholm Convention and coordinates IPEN engagement in global and regional meetings addressing implementation of the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management, or SAICM. Currently, DiGangi represents the public interest NGO sector on the SAICM Bureau. DiGangi holds a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology from the University of California, Irvine. Joe, would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you very much, Diana, and good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to present some information about the Stockholm Convention and some of the interesting events and decisions that took place at the most recent meeting. Just as a brief review, the convention is a global treaty, and it's interesting because it has as a goal to protect human health and the environment from the world's worst chemicals, and these are the POPs. So these are substances that are persistent. They do not break down very easily. They bioaccumulate in the food chain, so big fish have more of them than little fish. They travel long distances, and this results in them accumulating in the Arctic and in the Antarctic, and they are toxic. And so the treaty is actually the first global legally binding agreement that has as a goal to protect human health by banning chemicals. Now, the meeting that we went to is known as the Conference of the Parties, or the COP, and I'll just try to say the words instead of the initials. But so parties are governments that have ratified the treaty, and this means that they accept the treaty's legal obligations and they adjust their national laws to meet them. And in case you're wondering, the U.S. has not ratified this treaty, but 173 other countries have. And this gives the meeting a great deal of importance in sort of how the global governments actually view and address these substances. Now, the meeting is actually a negotiation between governments, but we have the ability to intervene and talk to government delegations about our views. And so this provides us an opportunity to participate pretty actively in the meeting. There were quite a few items on the agenda of the meeting, but I'm going to focus on the items that I think would be of greatest interest to Alaskans or have some connection to the Arctic environment. And I'd like to begin with the flame retardant topic. So these substances are added to consumer products, and according to the industry, they delay the onset of fire. They don't stop it completely. And 2 years ago, governments within the convention decided that 2 of them were so dangerous and so harmful that they needed to be eliminated globally. And these 2 substances, the short names for them are penta and octa. And when they decided to prohibit these flame retardants, unfortunately, they created a loophole which permitted the recycling of products that contain these substances. And the 2 main types of products that contain them are plastics, especially the ones in old electrical office equipment, and foam, which is used, polyurethane foam, which is used in furniture and in a variety of other places. And the loophole allows this to continue until 2030. So at that time, we made a big fight about this because we said, if you keep recycling these products that contain these substances and you do not remove them, then you are just going to have continued exposure to them. And so we tried to prevent the loophole, and we lost that fight. And then we said, okay, if you're going to do it, then you should label all of them so consumers know that these are recycled products that contain POPs. And we lost that fight, and then we said, if you're going to do that and not label them, at the very least, you should not permit their export, because we were concerned that this would be a convenient way to just dump a bunch of POPs containing products in developing countries. And they rejected that also. However, there was one good thing that did come out of the meeting, and that was they asked the treaty's expert committee to evaluate this practice. And the expert committee went off and did an evaluation of this practice, the recycling practice, and they came back to the recent meeting with a recommendation that sounded very familiar to us. They said, you should stop doing this as soon as possible. And the reason, they said, was because it's going to result in wider human and environmental contamination. The other thing that they mentioned was that it would result in the loss of the credibility of recycling, which was another issue we brought up, because once people find out that recycling means throwing away toxic chemicals into your products, that's not very helpful for recycling. So we were very interested in promoting the recommendation of the expert committee, but we needed to have some way to sort of demonstrate what this practice actually meant for consumers. The difficulty is, as I mentioned, that it's hard to tell which products have the recycled plastics or foam, except for one particular type of product, and that's carpet padding. So this is the stuff that if you have a wood floor or a concrete floor, you put the padding down first and then you put the carpet on top of it to give it a little bit of softness. And many of us have seen this stuff. It's the multicolored foam stuff, and that multicolor is actually different pieces of foam, recycled foam from different places. And the industry admits that this is recycled foam that contains these substances, and so we tested 26 samples that came from the U.S., Canada, and Hungary of this particular foam, and we asked, do these foam samples have the substances that are supposed to be banned globally? And we found that 23 of them, or almost 90% of them, did contain either penta or octa or both of them. And we included 4 samples from Alaska, and the Alaska samples were very interesting because they had both extremes. One of the samples had the 3rd highest level of penta of all the samples, and another sample had no brominated flame retardants that we could measure. So we sort of had both extremes in the same sample group. And so maybe Pam or others can describe sort of how this news was handled in Alaska. But the way it was handled at the meeting became very interesting. And this was because basically at the meeting, since this is a complicated topic, the only countries that participated in the discussion about this are the ones that do the recycling. So this was U.S., Japan, Canada, European Union, Switzerland, and that's basically in Australia. And the chair sent anybody who wanted to participate to go to a working group to make a decision, which would basically be a decision about how to handle the expert committee recommendation to stop doing this. And the result was a really weak text, and that's because the only governments that participated in the working group are the ones who did the recycling or do the recycling. And so their recommendation, this is a very language-driven process, so their recommendation, their draft one, had something like encouraging the countries to do something. They said do this where appropriate, take into account national circumstances, and it was sort of a polite way of saying ignore the recommendations. The next day on Thursday, this was discussed, and we realized that we needed to get at least something from these recommendations into a higher profile. And so we approached some countries from the African region and pointed out that one of the recommendations of the expert committee was that waste materials containing these substances should not be exported unless the purpose of it is to dispose of them in an environmentally sound manner. And this is sort of code talk for don't ship your waste old office electrical equipment to developing countries. That's basically what it is. And so it doesn't say that, but that's the implication. And of course, the African region is very interested in this because millions of tons of electrical equipment is dumped in Africa and recycled in a very crude way under heartbreaking conditions. And so the African region basically decided that this particular part of the recommendation should be highlighted, and they suggested text that requested parties to make sure that this did not happen. And many countries supported Africa in this proposal, and it triggered a huge fight that carried over into the next day. And for support, the African region had the support of the Arabic countries, all of the Latin American and Caribbean countries. India supported the suggestion. But the same group of countries that do the recycling opposed the African language. And so the meeting went on the last night, past midnight, basically pitting Kenya, who was speaking on behalf of the African region, against this group of developed countries. At the very end, they got language which encourages countries to ensure that this does not happen, which is weaker than request, but the good thing about it is that it highlights the issue and puts it on the map for countries as an issue which will be taken up in other meetings. So we thought that they put up a very brave fight, and certainly was very revealing how this small group of developed countries were sort of arguing for their right to dump these products in Africa. After the meeting, there was some very good press on the carpet study. Last week there was an article in the New York Times about it, and it'll be interesting to see how the study affects possible legislation on these substances in various states. Now, with just a few minutes remaining, I'll just mention a couple of the other items that were talked about at the meeting. One which is interesting, I think, is lindane. This is a pesticide which is also used for treating human head lice, and it was originally proposed by Mexico for global elimination under the treaty. And during the evaluation of this proposal, the expert committee raised concerns about lindane and the Arctic. They said lindane accumulates in wildlife, especially in Arctic wildlife. And they said there are potential risks identified from dietary exposure, particularly to people in Alaska and the circumpolar Arctic who depend on traditional foods such as fish and marine mammals. So that put it clearly on the map. And those facts, plus many others, led the governments to ban lindane globally. But just like in the flame retardants, they also created a loophole. And the loophole allowed for continued pharmaceutical use of lindane for head lice and scabies. And this loophole was pushed very heavily by the U.S., even though the U.S. has not ratified the treaty. So two nice things happened at the meeting, which was recently held about this topic. The first is that the World Health Organization had to write a report about lindane, and in their report, which was presented to the delegates, they extensively cited Pam Miller's report on lindane alternatives, so that was very nice to see that. And the second thing is that we worked with the Stockholm Convention Secretariat on a POPs-free project, which basically looks for and promotes products that substitute for POPs. And one of the two products which was featured at the meeting is a very cheap comb called the Leifmeister comb, which is sold by a nonprofit organization here in the U.S., and an organization which was actually sued by lindane formulators here in the U.S. So that was a very nice sort of justice kind of thing that happened at the meeting, since the product was featured as an example of a good way to use as an alternative for lindane, one which was a non-chemical alternative and completely safe. One of the other topics which was dealt with at the meeting dealt with wastes. And this is a topic which is important because the treaty says that you have to deal with wastes very carefully because POPs accumulate in the food chain, so you can't just dilute them because they will accumulate again. And it sets a limit in wastes, which basically says above that limit you have to be very careful and treat them extensively to destroy their POPs characteristics. And below that limit, you are considered, the waste is considered to be clean. And over the years, what's happened is that this topic has been a topic of controversy because the limit, which basically defines when they're clean, has not been sort of concretely set. And it's been 10 years now since they've been talking about this. And the reason it has not been set is because delegates gave the job to another treaty, the Basel Convention. And so many of us for many years have been trying to get the Stockholm Convention to take some responsibility for setting a limit which is based on protecting human health. And so we made a proposal that members and observers, which would be us, to the expert committee of the Stockholm Convention should participate in the setting of these limits. And I'm very happy to say that the result actually specifically mentions observers and says that members and observers of this expert committee should participate with the Basel Convention to develop these limits. These are particularly important because 2 years ago the treaty added 9 new substances, and so these need to be set for those substances. So that's a brief review of 3 items that were on the agenda. I'm happy to take questions about others, but I think I'll stop there so that others can also speak. Thank you very much.
And again, everyone, we'll have some time for questions at the end of the call. And I also, Joe, I just want to thank you for giving us a behind-the-scenes look at how even when a chemical is banned, loopholes can allow for its continued use. I think that's something that most people don't realize, so it's really helpful. At this time, I'd like to actually, one other thing. I'd like to mention that the study that Joe referred to is on our website. If you click on the title of the call for today, you can find that study about the flame retardant chemicals in carpet padding. Joe, did you want to add anything about any other resources? You do have another minute or so.
No, I think that's enough. That's always good to have extra time.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, thank you so much. Next, I'd like to introduce Waghiyi, Environmental Health and Justice Program Director for Alaska Community Action on Toxics. Vi is a bilingual Yupik Eskimo from Savunga on St. Lawrence Island, Alaska. Since Vi joined ACAT in 2002, she has worked closely with villages on St. Lawrence Island and in the Norton Sound region where contamination from military waste and persistent chemicals from around the world are accumulating in the Arctic food web and in traditional foods from the land and sea. Vi attended the 2009 and 2011 conference of parties as part of an Arctic Indigenous delegation. Welcome, Vi. Would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you, Diana, and thank you, Joe, for that great presentation. I'm honored to be part of ACAT and other organizations like IPEN and PEN, Pesticide Action Network, to be given this opportunity to be part of the Indigenous Peoples Global Caucus. We had participants from countries like Latin America. We also had members from Pacific region, myself from the Arctic, and others from North America region. And as Diana mentioned, I'm from St. Lawrence Island. I was born and raised in Savunga. I'm the daughter of the late John and Della Waghiyi. And my husband and I have 4 boys, and we live here in Anchorage. I still have a lot of relatives back home, my uncles and aunties and a lot of cousins. We come from big extended families. Our people continue to live a subsistence lifestyle. And due to the concerns of a former health aide, Annie Aloha, who started noticing a lot of cancer in our people from the 2 formerly used defense sites on our island, especially those families that had lived at one of the former Air Force bases, Northeast Cape. She tried to get help for our people for 20 years, and after she got sent to agency, about 7 of them, she came to Anchorage to an environmental conference, and our executive director, Pamela Miller, heard Annie, and the 2 of them got together. And basically our community-based participatory research project we have had on St. Lawrence Island, where we have hired and trained local people, and the leadership are very much involved from the beginning on what data to collect to get a bigger picture of why we were seeing all these health effects never seen before until after the military left. Just recently, we were very fortunate to get 5 bullhead whales on St. Lawrence Island. So we also hunt seals like bearded seal, ringed seal, spotted seal, and also walrus, and a lot of other wildlife that we depend on for our health and well-being. Traditions that are passed on generation to generation. We live a lifestyle where we're connected to our lands spiritually, culturally, and traditionally. So at the direction of the leadership, we did a traditional food study where we collected over 300 samples to test for contaminants. We did 1 batch for PCBs, pesticides, and another for heavy metals. And we were finding very high levels in the mangtak and rendered oils, and blubber of the three main foods that we eat throughout the year, the bowhead whale, the walrus, and seals. And this data we have been given permission from the leadership to bring to to the Stockholm Convention. As Diana mentioned, I was part of an Indigenous people member in 2009 and 2011, just recently. And I'm going to talk about some of the language that the Indigenous caucus, where they did a collective statement. I was given this opportunity to present this at the opening session. And on behalf of the Global Indigenous Peoples Caucus, for the Stockholm Convention COP5 opening session, our caucus that represented organizations, nations, and peoples from the Arctic, Africa, the Caribbean, North, Central, and South America, and the Pacific regions, our people continue to bear a disproportionate burden of the continued manufacturing, release, and use of these POPs that we're finding in our traditional foods and in our environment. And as Indigenous people, we emphasize that the total elimination of Endosulfan and other POPs will have a direct positive impact on safeguarding our health, our way of life, and our future generations, and that this must remain the central goal of the COP5 session, and that we seek the cooperation and commitment of countries in all regions to reach this goal to help impoverished Indigenous populations defend themselves against the impacts of POPs. Because the Arctic people suffer levels of POPs contamination in our blood and breast milk that are among the highest of any population on Earth, even though these chemicals have never been produced in the Arctic. This recognition inspired the negotiation of the Stockholm Convention, as noted in the preambular paragraph 3, that states, acknowledging that the Arctic ecosystems and Indigenous communities are particularly at risk because of the biomagnification of persistent organic pollutants, and that contamination of their traditional foods is a public health issue. So the collective statement that I read goes on to say that this must now motivate the Convention's strong implementation, that Endosulfan contaminates the traditional foods of our people, and we ask that they take strong action to include this harmful chemical in Annex A of the Convention with no exemptions. And that we respectfully ask that the delegates keep in mind that they're discussing issues that have severe impacts on Indigenous people and local communities, that long-range transport is not an abstract scientific idea for us. Short-term economic gains and interests need not be recognized as such and not permitted to take priority over our lives and health. And that we affirm that the formal participation and unique contributions of our Indigenous people is vital to maintaining the original spirit and intent of the Stockholm Convention, ensure that the success of its effectiveness evaluation process currently under development. As I mentioned, we have had a traditional food study on St. Lawrence Island. We have, along with the high levels of PCBs that we found in the mungtuck and rendered oils, up to 400 parts per billion. The only guidelines we can use is the EPA guideline for unlimited fish consumption, which is at 1.5 parts per billion. So our main foods are highly contaminated at levels we should not be eating our food. Some of the other current use chemicals in the Arctic include PBDEs, which are doubling every 7 years in the Arctic species, and other Endosulfan and other pesticides that we're finding in snowpacks within the Arctic national parks, fluorinated compounds and other toxic chemicals. Because we live in the Arctic, these contaminants come here through air and ocean currents, and we're finding them in our traditional foods, and they are affecting the health of our people. Some of the health effects that we're seeing include cancers, thyroid disease, and other reproductive health problems. The health of Alaska and Arctic children. Our infants have a much higher rate of hospitalization for infection than any other group of U.S. infants. Prenatal exposure to contaminants, which are known to affect the developing immune system, could play a role, and that possibility is now being examined. That's a quote from Dr. Jim Berner, who's a pediatrician with Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. Even though our traditional foods are very protective, they have a lot of omega-3 fatty acids, which, however, do not protect against cancer, but they're beneficial for brain function and can reduce risk of dying of a heart attack. They may be somewhat protective against diabetes and other blood pressure, also improve immune function. But we don't know the concentration of omega-3s in marine mammals, but expect them to be high. So we're hoping to do a traditional food study further to test the benefits that versus the risks. And these are some of the community-based project ACAT has been doing, not only on St. Lawrence Island, but other 15 communities in the Norton Sound region, where we have had two community-based projects funded from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. So I am grateful for organizations like ACAT because we're one of the few organizations statewide that works closely with communities like Savunga and Gamble and other regions throughout the state who have no other ways of getting help to address these concerns, whether it's from military contamination or maybe other development within the state, and from these persistent organic pollutants. Basically, we're being contaminated without our consent. So this is a great way to take action, not only on an international level with the Stockholm Convention, but also national level for chemical reform. And we also had a side event with our Indigenous People Caucus that was titled the Stockholm Convention and Indigenous Peoples' Human Rights, Community Health and Survival, Challenges and Solutions 10 years after the POPs Treaty adoption, because we wanted to also bring to the convention that this is a human rights issue, because we're finding them in our traditional foods. It's affecting our environment, and that we were asking the Conference of the Parties 5 to take this into consideration because it is a human rights issue. In 1997, a report on reforming and renewing the United Nations, the UN Secretary General affirmed the need to fully integrate the UN's human rights program into the broad range of the organization's activities. Unfortunately, this integration has not yet achieved its full potential in the work of the Stockholm Convention, so it's very important that we are at the table when it comes to making decisions, a lot of times miles and miles away from our communities, so we need to be at the table. And I'll be available if anybody have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Vi, for your presentation and for for all that you do. Again, we'll have opportunities for questions here in a few minutes. We have one more presenter, so finally I'd like to introduce Alaska Community Action on Toxics founder and executive director, Pam Miller. Pam serves as principal investigator of a research team that collaborates with Alaska tribes to address environmental health and justice issues in the Arctic and subarctic. She leads ACAT's national and international chemical policy reform efforts in close collaboration with other NGOs, and regularly presents new scientific evidence of the effects of POPs in the Arctic to national and international decision makers. As a member of the IPEN team working to ban endosulfan, Pam has attended annual POPs review committee meetings to bring to light the harmful effects of endosulfan in the Arctic. And Pam, you can go ahead and begin.
Thank you, Diana, and also thank you to my fellow presenters, Vi and Joe. I will discuss this morning, and good morning, everyone. I'll discuss one of the other significant decisions at the most recent Stockholm Convention Conference of Parties having to do with endosulfan. And just in the way of background information, endosulfan is a DDT-era insecticide that is very persistent. It can be transported long distances via atmospheric and oceanic currents. It's used on a variety of crops, including cotton, cereals, fruit trees, tomatoes, coffee, and tea, to name a few. It is also now one of the most abundant organochlorine pesticides in the global atmosphere and is not decreasing, unlike other so-called legacy chemicals in the Arctic. It's, in fact, increasing in air, water, and biota. Endosulfan attacks the nervous system and is linked with a range of harms to health. EPA, for instance, classifies endosulfan in its most extreme toxicity category, highly acutely toxic, because relatively small doses are lethal in lab studies. At lower and chronic exposures, endosulfan affects human health in long-lasting ways. A growing body of evidence, for instance, suggests that endosulfan is an endocrine-disrupting chemical that has estrogenic activity. Studies link endosulfan to birth defects, particularly of the male reproductive system, and is associated with delayed puberty in boys. Studies of populations exposed to endosulfan also suggest that it can increase the risk of autism. Endosulfan-related deaths and debilitation are common, particularly in developing countries where endosulfan is cheap and personal protective equipment is expensive or impossible to obtain. Some examples that are particularly devastating and that I think informed the Conference of Parties to ban this chemical globally is deaths to farm workers and children in Benin, South Africa, Colombia, the Philippines, and India. And in the state of Kerala in India, endosulfan has been linked with hundreds of deaths and disorders among cashew nut plantation workers and villagers. Several studies show ongoing deposition of endosulfan in the Arctic due to continued use at lower latitudes, which is one of the reasons why it's so important to take global action. The U.S. is in the process of phasing it out and made a decision to phase it out in 2009. However, it is continuing to accumulate in the Arctic. Endosulfan, as I mentioned, is one of the most common organochlorine contaminants in Arctic air. Based on some of the most recent data from the Arctic Monitoring Assessment Program, it is very likely that endosulfan continues to accumulate in the ice-free Arctic waters unabated, and we're finding that global climate change and warming in the Arctic in particular is increasing the atmospheric deposition of endosulfan from the atmosphere to the ice-free ocean surface. Endosulfan is one of the few persistent organic pollutants whose levels are actually increasing in marine biota in the Arctic. And we're also finding that the Western Arctic has some of the highest concentrations of endosulfan in the circumpolar Arctic, specifically in the Bering and Chukchi Seas. For example, the highest levels of alpha endosulfan were found in ring seals in the Western Arctic off Barrow. We also find that endosulfan, because of its extreme toxicity and persistence, is now banned in more than 80 countries. And I'll refer you to a global map that ACAD and IPEN created that demonstrates the countries around the world and the status of endosulfan use in those countries, and that is also posted on our website at the Che, Alaska site that Diana referred to. And some quotes that we included on that map from the EPA, for instance: the nationwide benefits to society as a whole are low for all uses of endosulfan and do not exceed the risks. And endosulfan poses unacceptable risks to agricultural workers and wildlife and can persist in the environment. And concerning endocrine disrupting effects, these effects resulting from exposure during critical developmental stages, that's in utero or to infants or children, will result in endocrine disruption and subsequent neurotoxicity, developmental or reproductive effects that are irreversible. So again, just this adds to the growing body of evidence about the harmful effects of endosulfan to wildlife and people. So with regard to endosulfan and the Stockholm Convention, again, just a little background information. It was proposed for consideration as a persistent organic pollutant by the European Union in 2007. The expert review committee, or the POPs review committee, deferred a decision because of controversy, and this is largely because India really attempted to block the inclusion of endosulfan under provisions of the treaty, because the government of India really has a vested interest in continuing use of endosulfan because they have a government subsidiary that manufactures it called Hindustan Chemical. In 2008, the POPs Review Committee, this is the scientific review committee that makes determinations about whether a chemical can move forward for consideration by the Conference of Parties for inclusion under the legally binding provisions of the treaty. They determined that endosulfan did meet the screening criteria for persistence, long-range transport, bioaccumulation, toxicity. That's the scientific criteria that are set forth in Annex D of the Convention. Then in 2009, the POPs Review Committee made a decision taking into account that a lack of full scientific certainty should not prevent a proposal from proceeding, that endosulfan is likely, as a result of long-range transport, to lead to significant adverse human health and environmental effects such that global action is warranted. So in 2010, then, the POPROC decided to recommend to the Conference of Parties to consider endosulfan to be listed in Annex A for global elimination with specific exemptions. Then in April of this year, at the most recent Conference of Parties that Joe and Vi and I participated in, the Conference of Parties made the remarkable decision to institute a global ban on the pesticide endosulfan by listing it under Annex A of the Convention with limited exemptions that were requested by India, China, and Uganda. The Conference of Parties will undertake a work program to support implementation of alternatives to endosulfan, and I think one of the most important things for us as non-governmental organizations, as well as the governments that are party to the convention, is to stay engaged in promoting safe alternatives, remembering that more than 80 countries have banned it, so many countries have already implemented safe alternatives to endosulfan. This decision came about because of the actions and information provided by many environmental health and justice organizations from around the world, and most impressively, I think, from our colleagues in India who organized demonstrations, hunger strikes, providing information to their government to prompt India to eventually concur with the global community that an international ban of this hazardous chemical is warranted. So this was quite a remarkable decision. And before I end my presentation this morning, I just want to very briefly mention that another significant action at the Conference of Parties was a presentation of a new report. This was produced by the United Nations Environment Program and the Arctic Monitoring Assessment Program Expert Group. It's called Climate Change and POPs, Predicting the Impacts, and it really looks at the synergies of climate change and contaminants and how climate warming is exacerbating the problem of the mobilization and transport of POPs chemicals, particularly in the Arctic. And I won't review the findings, which are quite detailed, but I'll note that IPEN and ACAT contributed to this report, and also there is a section on policy recommendations calling for a coordinated and global response to counteract immediate, medium, and long-term effects on health and on human health and ecosystems of concurrent exposure to POPs and changing climates, really calling for a precautionary approach to guide the development and adoption of policy actions to address the combined negative effects of climate change and POPs. So this is a very significant report. We also have a link to this on our website, and Diana provided the reference there, so you can take a look at the report. I think it's very important, particularly for us in Alaska and the circumpolar Arctic. And I'll stop there, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Pam. Again, that website is akaction.org, and if you click on the title of the call, you can access all of those links to those other resources. I would like to thank all of our presenters once again for taking the time to be with us today and for sharing their expertise and their experience at the recent Stockholm Convention Conference of Parties. We covered a lot of ground, and I imagine there are a number of questions. So at this time, we'd like to open the lines for questions and comments. Please wait a moment while we unmute the lines. And as a reminder, we invite you to use the blog if you'd like to. To do so, go to healthandenvironment.org, click on News and Events, and then on Working Group Calls, and you'll find the call there. You can put your question there as well if you'd like. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, you'll need to press *6 on your telephone to unmute your line. And please state your name and affiliation. When you're done with your question, if you could then press *6 again, your line will be muted, and it'll just help the call run smoothly and not have too much background noise. Thank you so much. So go ahead. If someone would like to pose a question to one of our presenters, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Mitchell Kaisluk from native village of Savunga. I was wondering about those trash bags we use for Joe. I wonder if you guys test any of those for any contaminants.
Okay, thank you for your question. I didn't quite hear the name of the product. What was it?
I think he was just saying trash bags, garbage bags. Is that correct, Mitchell?
Yeah, those trash bags we use, those black ones, 33-gallon size.
Ah, okay. No, we did not test those. What we focused on was actually the foam, products made using foam, and specifically the ones that are used for carpet padding. The trash bags are, I think, they're made out of a different substance, and one that has some, is actually one of the cleaner plastics. Plastics have their disadvantages, but that's actually one of the cleaner ones compared to some of the other ones.
Thank you. Are there other questions out there?
Diana, Pam, I just have a question of Joe. Joe, it's been remarkable to see the national and international press coverage about the IPEN report, and I'm just wondering, and the article in the New York Times last week was great to see, and I'm just wondering if you're seeing any reactions from policymakers as a result of the widespread media coverage.
Thank you. So far, I have not heard anything from anybody, and I have not seen any sort of written reaction from any policymakers, but I have a feeling that they're aware of the coverage. Ironically, our press release on the big fight that I talked about between the African region and this small group of rich countries that want to continue the recycling, that press release ironically ended up on the Stockholm Convention website, describing the results of the meeting. I'm not sure if they read it before they posted it there, but it's actually posted on the website. So I'm sure that government delegations are certainly reading this, and the nature of the fight itself was so sharp and so intense that I think people will certainly remember it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, you need to press *6 to unmute your line, if you haven't done so already. Any other questions about the carpet padding study, the ban on endosulfan, the actions of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus at the Stockholm Convention meeting?
Anyone else?
Don't be shy. We left a lot of time for this discussion because we knew we were covering so much, and we have such experienced presenters on the line. So,
well, while we're waiting for people to muster up their courage, I also just wanted to mention that I think one of the strongest provisions and most important provisions of the treaty is a provision that allows the addition of new chemicals. And we mentioned that 9 new chemicals were added in 2009, and Endosulfan was added at this most recent Conference of Parties. And most recently, there are several substances that have been proposed for nomination by the European Union. And I wondered if Joe might be willing to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. There are 3 of them that were proposed. I'll see if I can remember them. One of them is pentachlorophenol, which is a substance that's often used to treat telephone poles and other wooden, fence posts and poles that get stuck in the ground to prevent their sort of attack by fungi and other things. And that's quite toxic, actually. And another one is hexachlorobutadiene, which is one of the substances that I believe also contributes to destruction of the ozone layer, in addition to other things. It's used in the electronics industry and some other places. And the third one is chlorinated naphthalene. And those are substances that are they're sort of relatives of the waxes, and they're a large family of substances. So these will be 3 new proposals that will enter the expert group process, and we can expect the industry associations that are involved in those substances to come and argue why they should be continued to be used. And we will have our small delegation that will present some scientific and technical information about them, but one of our other main functions in participating in that committee is to kind of be the conscience of the committee and to really bring up the sort of human effects and the social effects of these substances. It doesn't always get taken into consideration, but we just keep saying it and keep pushing that viewpoint.
Thank you, Joe.
This is Lynn Cherry. I have a question, please.
Yes.
So, given that the U.S. is not a signatory to the convention, it still sounds like they have a lot of influence and participate a lot. Can one of you comment on how that works, given that they're not a signatory, and how that's viewed by the countries that have signed on, and how much influence do they actually have in the situation?
I'm happy to take a stab at that one. Well, you're right. The U.S. does have quite a bit of influence. They're somewhat humiliated at the meetings because they do not get to speak until all the other parties have decided that they're finished speaking. And so since there are 173 of them, the U.S. is at the end of the list, and they're actually in the part of the discussion where we are, because theoretically we're both observers, though some observers are more equal than other ones. And the way that it's viewed by some of the other participants in the meeting is kind of in a realistic way, which is when you come from the world's biggest economy, you get to sort of have some influence. And so they use that in mostly in the past it's been in negative ways, actually. They often advance positions which are quite similar to the chemical industry positions on topics. And I wish that they would play a more positive role internationally, actually. But they have the ability at the beginning of a discussion to say things, but they also participate extensively in all the expert committees that forward recommendations to the larger body. So they participate at all levels.
Hello, this is Fran Solomon from Western Washington University. I have a question about endosulfan. You mentioned, this is for Pam, you mentioned limited exemptions on the ban. Could you describe what those are?
Yes. I think in order for India to agree to be party to the decision to add endosulfan, and other countries as well that continue uses, they are requesting, and parties can request specific exemptions that are time limited for a period of 5 years. Mm-hmm. India requested a number of exemptions for large-scale agricultural products such as cotton, jute. Uganda requested an exemption for coffee, tea. All three countries, India, China, and Uganda, requested exemptions for tea. So, and there were several others that were mentioned, and I think it will be a challenge for the governments as well as NGOs who participate in this process to really encourage the rapid adoption of alternatives which are readily available, and to provide this information. And the Conference of Parties has also asked the Scientific Expert Committee, the POPs Review Committee, to prepare information about the availability and affordability of alternatives. So we'll be very active in that process to ensure the rapid phase-out, and to ensure that exemptions are very limited, and to close the loophole on that exemption.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
We probably have time for one more question. And anybody else? Okay, well, I would like to thank everyone again for joining us today. If you do have additional questions or comments, please feel free to contact ACAT at 907-222-7714, or you can email me at Diana, D-I-A-N-A, at akaction.org, and I'll make sure your question gets into the right person's hands. The recording for this call will be available on our website by the end of the week. And I'd also like to remind you that we have another Che Alaska call next week on Wednesday, 9 a.m., with Jeannie Rizzo, CEO and President of the Breast Cancer Fund. And she will be discussing the connection between breast cancer and the environment. And if you haven't RSVP'd for that call yet, you may do so by emailing me, Diana at akaction.org. Thank you, everyone, very much for joining us this morning, and we look forward to next week's call. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.